Injustice bears down and shadows cloud the truth. It's in those moments that courage speaks loudest. What would you do when faced with assumptions that threaten your dignity? This is the story of a woman who turned adversity into strength, proving that grace and resilience can rewrite even the most unfair narratives. Welcome to our channel, where we bring you powerful emotional stories that resonate deeply and inspire change. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to join our journey of spreading hope and positivity. The late morning sun cast a warm glow over the quiet streets as Nora steered her modified car toward the doctor's office. Her voice echoed gently in the vehicle as she commanded the car to adjust its speed. It was a marvel of modern technology, designed specifically for her unique needs, an innovation that gave her the independence she cherished. Born without arms or legs, Nora had spent her entire life proving she could overcome any challenge thrown her way. The hum of the engine was comforting, a steady rhythm that matched her resolve. Today's appointment was a milestone. Pregnant with her first child, Nora was determined to do everything in her power to ensure her baby's health. Every drive in her specially modified car reminded her that she was capable, resilient, and more than prepared to take on motherhood. But as she approached an intersection, the sharp flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror jolted her out of her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat, the siren's wail piercing the calm. She glanced at the dashboard, quickly issuing a voice command to pull the car over safely. The vehicle slowed, pulling neatly to the shoulder. Nora took a deep breath as the patrol car stopped behind her. She hadn't done anything wrong. Her adaptive controls sometimes caused slight weaving, but she had passed every test to ensure her driving was safe and compliant. Still, the familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. Through the side mirror, she saw the officer approaching, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense stride. His uniform was pressed, his badge glinting in the sunlight. His face, however, was set in a scowl. "License and registration," the officer barked, rapping his knuckles on the window. His voice was sharp, impatient. Nora complied, using her voice command system to lower the window. "Good morning, officer," she said, keeping her tone calm and polite. "I'd be happy to provide my information. My name is Nora, and I want to let you know up front that I have a disability. My car is modified for adaptive driving." Trent's eyes narrowed as he cut her off. "You were weaving back there. Looks like someone was distracted," he said flatly, his tone dripping with suspicion. He glanced into the car, taking in the sleek controls and the lack of a traditional steering wheel. "What is this? Some kind of excuse?" Nora's jaw tightened, but she refused to let his words rattle her. "It's not an excuse, officer. It's my reality. My vehicle is specially designed for voice commands because I don't have arms or legs. I've passed all required tests, and I'm fully licensed to drive." Trent leaned closer, peering at her as if searching for a flaw in her story. "You're telling me you control this thing with your voice? That's a safety hazard if I've ever seen one." Nora's hands, if she'd had them, would have curled into fists. Instead, she met his gaze with quiet strength. "It's legal, and I've driven without incident for years. If you'd like, I can show you the documentation that proves it." But Trent wasn't interested in documents. His face hardened, his jaw clenching as if he had already decided she was lying. "You expect me to believe you can safely operate a vehicle like this? I've seen a lot of stunts, but this takes the cake." Nora felt her pulse quicken. She had dealt with skepticism before, but the blatant hostility in Trent's voice was something new. "Officer," she said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly, "I understand this might be unfamiliar to you, but I assure you I'm following the law. I have every right to be on the road." Trent straightened, his expression cold. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "Step out," she repeated, disbelief coloring her tone. "Officer, I just explained. I physically can't do that. I don't have arms or legs." Trent crossed his arms, unmoved. "If you don't cooperate, I'll remove you myself." The threat sent a chill down Nora's spine. She could feel her baby kick gently, as if sensing her distress. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "You're not listening. I'm not refusing to cooperate. I literally cannot get out of this car." But Trent wasn't listening. He opened the door, his hands hovering awkwardly as if unsure how to proceed. "I've had enough of this," he muttered. "You're unfit to drive. You're putting yourself and others at risk." Tears pricked the corners of Nora's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice resolute. "You're judging me based on what you think you see, not what's real." Her words hung in the air, but Trent didn't respond. He reached for his radio, calling for backup as if she were a threat. Nora felt her composure faltering, her breath quickening. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a test of her humanity, her dignity, and her strength. As the seconds ticked by, Nora realized she had a choice: to let fear consume her or to stand firm in the face of injustice. She chose the latter, lifting her chin as she stared up at Trent. "I will not be invisible," she said quietly but fiercely, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. The atmosphere grew tense, the air heavy with disbelief and rising anger. Nora sat firmly in her driver's seat, her chest heaving as she tried to remain composed. Officer Trent, his face set in a mask of frustration and stubborn authority, yanked open the car door, his large frame casting a shadow over her. "I'm giving you one last chance to cooperate," he barked, his voice louder now, more forceful. "Get out of the car, or I'll have to remove you myself." Nora's voice cracked but didn't falter. "Officer, I've told you already. I physically cannot step out of this car. I'm disabled. I'm pregnant. What you're asking is impossible." Her calm delivery, though tremulous, seemed only to agitate him further. Without another word, Trent reached into the car, his hands awkwardly fumbling around her. Nora stiffened, her heart pounding in disbelief. "Don't touch me," she cried, her voice ringing with a mixture of fear and outrage. She tried to lean back in her seat as Trent attempted to lift her out, his inexperience with the situation painfully clear. A small crowd began to form nearby, drawn by the escalating commotion. Bystanders pulled out their phones, some recording the scene as others exchanged murmurs of shock and discomfort. "Help!" Nora's voice broke as she called out to the onlookers, her eyes darting toward them, silently pleading. "This isn't right." Trent struggled, his face red from exertion and embarrassment. He was clearly unprepared to deal with someone in Nora's situation, but refused to back down. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered through gritted teeth, though his grip was hesitant, uncertain. The growing crowd buzzed with concern. From across the street, an older man named Mr. Baker, who had been sitting outside a small gas station sipping his coffee, noticed the scene. His brow furrowed in disbelief as he watched Trent's clumsy attempt to remove Nora from the car. The retired teacher pushed himself off the bench, his cane tapping against the pavement as he crossed the road toward them. "What on earth is going on here?" he asked aloud, his voice cutting through the tension. He stopped a few feet from the officer and held up his hand. "Son, you need to stop this," he said, his tone steady but firm. "She's telling the truth. She's disabled. Can't you see that?" Trent glanced at Baker, irritated by the interruption. "Sir, I'm handling the situation. Please stay out of it." Baker shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "You're not handling anything. You're making a mistake, and you need to stop before it gets worse." Nora, tears streaming down her face, looked toward Baker. Despite her fear, her voice carried strength. "Thank you," she said softly, though her eyes remained locked on Trent. "Officer, you can't treat people like this. I'm pregnant, I'm disabled, but I am not invisible." The weight of her words momentarily froze Trent in place. He looked around, noticing the bystanders' glares, and the phones pointed directly at him. But instead of stepping back, he doubled down. "Everyone stay back," he ordered sharply, waving his hand as if to scatter the crowd. "This is a safety issue." Baker didn't budge. "The only danger here is your lack of understanding," he shot back. His words earned murmurs of agreement from the onlookers, some of whom began shouting at Trent to leave her alone. Meanwhile, Nora's adaptive car system, which had been unintentionally triggered during the struggle, sent out a distress call. In the commotion, Nora barely noticed the soft chime of the automated message. "Emergency alert sent. Contacting primary emergency contact." Miles away, Marcus, Nora's husband, was at home when his phone vibrated. A former Marine and a double amputee himself, Marcus was no stranger to crisis. The message on his phone chilled him. "Emergency distress activated. Vehicle incident detected." Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed his keys and sped out the door, his wheelchair smoothly gliding into the ramped vehicle he operated with precision. He didn't need details. He knew Nora's system only activated in dire situations. Back at the scene, the tension had reached its peak. Nora's voice cracked with emotion, but her words cut through the air like steel. "You're not listening to me. You see my body and think I'm incapable, but I've lived my whole life proving people like you wrong. What gives you the right to decide what I can and cannot do?" The crowd began to shift closer, emboldened by Nora's courage. Baker turned back to her, nodding in quiet support. "You're doing great, dear," he said, his voice gentle but audible. Suddenly, the sound of a vehicle screeching to a halt drew everyone's attention. Marcus's van came to a stop, and the door opened smoothly as he wheeled himself out with practiced ease. His presence was commanding, his face calm but his eyes blazing with determination. "Step away from my wife," Marcus said, his voice measured but firm. The crowd parted as he moved forward, his wheelchair rolling steadily over the pavement. Trent turned, startled by Marcus's sudden arrival. "And who are you?" he demanded, though his voice lacked the same confidence as before. "I'm the man who's going to hold you accountable," Marcus replied, his tone unwavering. He reached Nora's side, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "What do you think you're doing, manhandling a pregnant disabled woman like she's some sort of criminal?" The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices growing louder. For the first time, Trent's authority seemed to waver. He stepped back, looking from Marcus to Nora, to the sea of eyes now fixated on him. Nora, still shaking, looked at Marcus with relief and gratitude. "You're here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm always here," Marcus replied softly, his gaze never leaving Trent. "And we're not letting this go." The crowd hushed as Marcus wheeled himself into the scene, his presence commanding yet calm. His broad shoulders carried the weight of years of discipline, and his sharp eyes scanned the chaotic scene. He saw the fear in Nora's face, the tension in the officer's rigid posture, and the simmering anger of the onlookers. His heart ached, but he pushed the emotion aside, focusing on what needed to be done. "Officer," Marcus said, his voice steady and firm, cutting through the murmurs, "I need you to explain exactly what's happening here." Trent turned, startled by Marcus's sudden arrival. He opened his mouth to retort, but something about Marcus's presence, the unshakable calm, the quiet authority, made him hesitate. "This is none of your concern," Trent said stiffly, though his voice lacked its earlier bite. "I'm handling a situation involving an unfit driver." Marcus moved closer, his wheelchair rolling smoothly over the pavement. He stopped beside Nora, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That unfit driver is my wife," he said, his tone firm but measured. "And you're wrong about her. She's fully licensed, fully compliant with the law, and far more capable than you've given her credit for." Trent's jaw tightened, but Marcus continued, pulling a neatly folded set of documents from the bag attached to his wheelchair. "Here's her certification," he said, holding the papers out toward the officer. "Everything you need to know is right here. She's not breaking any laws, officer, but you are." The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by Marcus's calm confidence. Trent glanced at the documents but didn't reach for them, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his face reddening. I didn't know," he stammered, his earlier authority faltering. "No, you didn't," Marcus replied, his voice sharpening. "Because you didn't listen. You judged her before you even gave her a chance to explain. And now you've humiliated her in front of all these people. Is that what you call serving and protecting?" Trent's face twitched as Marcus's words hit home. He opened his mouth to argue, but Marcus interrupted him. "Do you even realize what you've done?" he asked, his voice softer now, tinged with something deeper, disappointment. "You're not just dealing with a disabled woman. You're dealing with someone who's spent her entire life proving people like you wrong. Someone who's fought for every inch of her independence." Marcus paused, his gaze narrowing as he studied Trent's face. Something flickered in the officer's eyes, a glimmer of recognition. And then, suddenly, it hit him. "You don't remember me, do you?" Marcus asked, his voice quieter now but no less commanding. Trent blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It was years ago," he said. "You were a rookie back then, fresh out of the academy. I was just back from deployment. Remember that call you got about a Marine barricaded in his apartment? The one threatening to hurt himself?" Trent's breath caught. The memory surfaced like a long-buried photograph. He saw himself as a young, inexperienced officer, standing frozen in the doorway of a darkened apartment. A fellow Marine, haunted by memories of war, had been on the edge of a breakdown. Trent had been paralyzed, unsure how to handle the situation, until Marcus arrived. "You called for backup," Marcus continued, his voice gentle but unwavering. "And I showed up. I talked him down. I reminded him of what he had to live for. And when it was over, you told me you'd never forget what you saw that day." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Trent's face paled as the memory crystallized. He looked at Marcus, truly seeing him for the first time. "That was you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Marcus nodded. "That was me. And now here we are, all these years later, and I'm standing in front of you again. Only this time, you're the one who needs to be reminded of what's right." Trent's tough exterior cracked. His shoulders slumped, and his eyes darted to Nora, who sat silently, tears streaking her face. Shame washed over him like a tidal wave. "I didn't mean," he began, his voice trembling. I didn't understand." "It's not about what you meant," Marcus said, his voice soft but firm. "It's about what you did. And now you need to fix it." Trent stepped back, his hands trembling. "I'm sorry," he said, his words stumbling out in a rush. I didn't think. I made assumptions, and I was wrong." He turned to Nora, his eyes pleading. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was just trying to do my job. But I see now I let my biases get in the way." Nora looked at him, her tears still falling, but there was no anger in her gaze, only exhaustion. "It's not me you need to convince," she said quietly. "It's yourself." The crowd was silent as Trent backed away, his once confident posture now hunched with guilt. Marcus placed his hand on Nora's shoulder again, his touch grounding her. "Let's go home," he said softly. Nora nodded, and as Marcus began wheeling her toward their car, the crowd parted to let them through. Behind them, Trent stood frozen, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like never before. The crowd slowly dispersed as Nora and Marcus prepared to leave the scene. Officer Trent stood motionless, his thoughts a storm of regret and shame. The murmurs of the bystanders, expressions of outrage, disbelief, and even pity, echoed in his ears. His authority, his pride, had been shattered, and for the first time in his career, he felt truly vulnerable. In the weeks that followed, Trent took their words to heart. He voluntarily enrolled in sensitivity and diversity training, learning from people with disabilities and marginalized communities about the challenges they face. He began volunteering with local organizations that supported disabled individuals, taking time to understand their stories and the systemic barriers they encountered. With every session, Every interaction, his perspective shifted, his understanding deepened. Trent also sat down to write a heartfelt letter of apology to Nora and Marcus. In it, he expressed his remorse and outlined the steps he was taking to become a better officer in person. "Your grace and resilience have inspired me," he wrote. "I vow to ensure that no one else has to experience what you went through because of my ignorance." When Nora received the letter, she read it aloud to Marcus. They exchanged a quiet look, both moved by the sincerity in Trent's words. "People can change," Marcus said softly, and Nora nodded, her heart lighter knowing the pain of that day had sparked something good. Trent reached for his radio with trembling hands, taking a deep breath before calling his supervisor. "This is Officer Trent," he began, his voice unsteady. "I need to report an incident and take responsibility for my actions." He recounted the entire episode, sparing no detail about his mistakes, from his initial assumptions to his aggressive escalation. His supervisor listened quietly before responding. "We'll discuss this further, Officer Trent. You did the right thing by admitting your fault. Now it's time to fix it." As the call ended, Trent turned back toward the parking lot where Nora and Marcus were getting ready to leave. Gathering his courage, he approached them, his posture humble. "Mrs. Broaddus, Mr. Broaddus," he began, struggling to find the words. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to say this. I'm deeply sorry for the way I treated you today. I made assumptions I had no right to make, and I let my own ignorance guide my actions. I will do everything I can to make this right." Nora looked at him, her eyes still tired from the ordeal, but soft with understanding. "What you did was wrong, officer," she said, her voice steady but kind. "It caused me pain, more than you probably realize. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means giving someone the chance to do better." She held his gaze, her words carrying the weight of her strength. "I'm giving you that chance. Don't waste it." Marcus nodded in agreement, his hand resting protectively on Nora's shoulder. "It's not about what you say right now, Trent," he added. "It's about what you do next." Trent nodded, tears threatening to blur his vision. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice heavy with emotion. Months later, in the soft glow of a sunny afternoon, Nora and Marcus hosted a baby shower in their backyard. Friends and family gathered, the air filled with laughter and love. Nora, now glowing with the joy of impending motherhood, sat beside Marcus as he held up a folded piece of paper. "I want to read something," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying over the chatter. "It's from someone who owes this family a great deal." He unfolded Trent's letter, his steady tone capturing the attention of the guests. As he read Trent's words, the room grew quiet, the heartfelt apology resonating with everyone present. When he finished, Nora placed a hand on her belly, smiling warmly. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said, her voice full of reflection. "How something so painful can lead to something so meaningful. If that day hadn't happened, maybe he wouldn't have changed. And maybe Justice wouldn't have his name," Marcus added, his eyes twinkling. The name Justice was a perfect fit, a reminder of what they had fought for and the values they wanted to instill in their child. Late that night, after the last guest had left, Nora and Marcus sat together in their baby's nursery. The soft light of a lamp bathed the room in a warm glow. Their son, tiny and perfect, lay sleeping in his crib, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a deep sense of peace settling over him. "We turned a bad day into something good," he said quietly, his hand reaching for Nora's. Nora squeezed his hand gently, her heart full. "And we'll keep doing it, one day at a time," she replied, her voice soft but resolute. The room fell into a comfortable silence as they watched their son sleep, the past fading into the background, replaced by hope and love for the future. You are highly appreciated for watching this emotional yet insightful tale. Did you enjoy it? If you did, kindly let us know in the comment, and also like, share, subscribe, and stay connected in our community. We share inspirational quotes, polls, and more to keep you informed educated and entertained in our Tales Craft channel. Let's continue to speak up for justice, especially among the vulnerable. See you in the next tale.